From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia.
No collusion, no more indictments, no obstruction of justice. As special counsel Robert Mueller ends his 22-month probe, Democrats are calling on Attorney General William Barr to make public the full Mueller report while criticizing Barr for quickly deciding not to charge Trump with obstruction of justice.
The president has not been exonerated by the special counsel, yet the Attorney General has decided not to go further or apparently to share those findings with the public. We cannot simply rely on what may be a hasty, partisan interpretation of the facts.
We'll host a debate between two Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, The Intercept's Glenn Greenwald, who's been one of the country's most prominent Russiagate skeptics, and David K. Johnston, author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Special counsel Robert Mueller has ended his 22-month probe, concluding President Trump and his aides did not conspire or coordinate with Russia in order to influence the 2016 election. While the full Mueller report has yet to be made public, Attorney General William Barr sent a 4-page letter to congressional leaders Sunday laying out his interpretation of Mueller's findings. Mueller also examined whether Trump could be criminally charged for obstructing justice, but he did not come to a definitive conclusion. Barr quoted a passage from the Mueller report saying, while this report does not conclude the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him, unquote. In his letter, Barr, who became Attorney General just last month, announced he and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had concluded there is not sufficient evidence to, quote, establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense, unquote. President Trump responded to Barr's letter by tweeting, no collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration, keep America great. Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill are calling on Barr to release the full Mueller report as well as underlying documentation. Many Democrats criticize Barr for taking just 48 hours to conclude Trump had not committed obstruction of justice. This is New York Congressmember Gerald Nadler, chair of the House Judiciary Committee.
Attorney General Barr, who auditioned for his role with an open memorandum suggesting that the obstruction investigation was unconscionable, and that it was almost impossible for any president to commit obstruction of justice since he is the head of the executive branch, made a decision about that evidence in under 48 hours. His conclusions raise more questions than the answer, given the fact that Mueller uncovered evidence that, in his own words, does not exonerate the president.
Trump and his associates still face a number of investigations, including ones led by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, the Attorney General of New York, and congressional Democrats. We'll have more on the Mueller report after headlines with journalists Glenn Greenwald and David K. Johnston. The death toll from the catastrophic Cyclone Idai has surpassed 750 people across Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Over 100,000 people are now living in camps for the displaced 10 days after the cyclone made landfall. As rescue efforts continue in the southeastern African nations, officials are warning of cholera and malaria outbreaks. The UN says nearly half the 1.7 million people affected by Idai are children. In Britain, an estimated 1 million demonstrators filled the streets of London Saturday, calling for a new referendum on Brexit. The fate of Britain's exit from the European Union remains in the balance days after EU officials agreed to delay it at least until April 12th, while Prime Minister Theresa May attempts to convince lawmakers to approve a deal. Political leaders addressed crowds at Saturday's protests. This is London Mayor Sadiq Khan.
The British people didn't vote for the government to gamble on our future. You didn't vote for the national nightmare we have. It's time to give you, us, the British people, a final say on Brexit.
In France, Yellow Vest protesters took to the streets for the 19th straight week of anti-government demonstrations, days after the French authorities announced a clampdown on the movement, including banning marching on the Champs-Élysées and other areas and the deployment of military forces. The Yellow Vests have called out French President Emmanuel Macron's pro-business economic policies and are calling for fair wages for working and middle-class citizens and heavier taxation on the wealthy. This is a demonstrator from Paris at Saturday's protest.
Macron does nothing for us, for his people. On the contrary, he's against his people. He prioritizes everyone else, not those who are French, not the French people, even those who are working and getting squeezed dry.
Over 200 arrests were reported across France over the weekend, along with some clashes between police and protesters. In Thailand, voters took to the polls Sunday in the country's first election since a 2014 coup put a military junta in power. The pro-military Palang Pracharat Party was ahead by a narrow lead with 94% of the votes counted. Two competing political parties have raised doubts about the results, citing irregularities. Pheu Thai, the party of exiled former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawatra, said it will try to form a government even if it loses the popular vote by building a coalition with other parties. Thailand's government runs on a parliamentary system. Final results from the vote are not expected until later this week. In Gaza, mourners buried 3 Palestinians killed during weekend protests. Habib al-Masri was shot at a protest against the Israeli army Saturday and later died of his wounds. Nidal Shatat and Jihad Harara were shot and killed at Friday's Great March of Return protests, while at least 60 others were injured. This week's protests will mark 1 year since the start of the Great March of Return, March 30th, 2018. Over 250 Palestinians have been killed since the start of the protests, according to local reports, and thousands more injured. Meanwhile, Israeli air raids struck parts of Gaza Sunday, including a refugee camp, causing damage but no reported deaths. Israeli authorities reported rockets fired from Gaza struck a home in Israel near Tel Aviv Monday, injuring at least 7 people. They said Hamas is responsible for the attack, but the group has not claimed responsibility. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he's cutting short his trip to Washington, D.C., and flying back today after a meeting with President Trump. He said Israel will respond forcefully. Netanyahu had been scheduled to speak at the annual policy conference of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, on Tuesday. In Somalia, at least 15 people died after a Saturday gun battle between security forces and al-Shabaab militants at an official government building in the capital, Mogadishu. The al-Shabaab fighters detonated a car bomb outside the building before storming the ministries of Labor and Public Works. Among the dead was the Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, Sakar Ibrahim Abdallah. In the West African nation of Mali, the United Nations said armed men killed at least 134 people from a Fulani community Saturday. Tensions and violence between Fulani and Dogon communities have been on the rise. In December, Human Rights Watch said, quote, militia killings of civilians in central and northern Mali are spiraling out of control, unquote. The government has since banned the Dogon hunting militia that's believed to be responsible for this latest attack. In Afghanistan, an airstrike killed at least 14 civilians Saturday in northern Kunduz province, according to Afghan officials. 4 Afghan soldiers were also killed in the attack. The U.S. blamed the attack on the Taliban. On Friday, 2 U.S. Special Forces and 4 Afghan Special Forces fighters were killed in a joint operation in the same region. In a separate incident in southern Helmand province, 4 people were killed and 30 injured by Taliban bombs, according to local officials. At least 40 Afghan security force personnel are believed to have been killed in a Taliban attack in the region last week. The deaths come as the U.S. is in the midst of ongoing peace talks with the Taliban. The U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces said Saturday the last territorial stronghold of the Islamic State has fallen. SDF fighters have been battling ISIS in the border town of Baghouz for several weeks before the announced defeat. The U.S. hailed the announcement, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo adding the U.S. mission is ongoing. He said, quote, our mission there hasn't changed. We still have work to do to make sure radical Islamic terrorism doesn't continue to grow, unquote. Back in the U.S., a white former police officer charged with killing unarmed African-American teenager Antoine Rose in East Pittsburgh last year was acquitted Friday. Video of the June 19th shooting shows Officer Michael Rosfeld shot Rose in the back while the teenager was trying to flee a traffic stop. Rosfeld had been sworn in to the city's police department just 3 hours before the shooting. At a vigil Sunday, Rose's mother, Michelle Kenny, said she would continue to fight for justice for her son.
The problem is the law. The problem isn't the individual. If we rewrite the law, then all individuals got to abide by it. So that's where we got to start at. So, no, it's not over for me. I got a long fight ahead of me, a long fight. We got to rewrite the law, and one way or the other, Michael Rosfeld got to answer for what he did to Antoine.
President Trump appeared to undermine his own administration Friday when he announced he's withdrawing new sanctions on North Korea. He tweeted, "It was announced today by the U.S. Treasury that additional large-scale sanctions would be added to those already existing sanctions on North Korea. I have today ordered the withdrawal of those additional sanctions!" Exclamation point. The tweet likely refers to still unconfirmed future sanctions, according to administration officials, as no new sanctions against North Korea were announced Friday. White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders did not clear up the confusion, but indicated Trump made the announcement because, quote, President Trump likes Chairman Kim, unquote. Last month, the second summit between the two leaders broke down without any progress made toward a denuclearization deal. A student who survived last year's shooting massacre at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, died by suicide Saturday, according to local authorities. The unnamed student is the second Parkland survivor to die by suicide in a week after 19-year-old Sydney Aiello's death last weekend. Sydney Aiello suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and survivor's guilt, according to her mother. 17 students, staff, and teachers were killed in Parkland February 14, 2018, in one of the deadliest school shootings in U.S. history. David Hogg, a Parkland survivor and gun control activist, tweeted Sunday, "How many more kids have to be taken from us as a result of suicide for the government school district to do anything? R.I.P. 17 plus 2. You can reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. Supporters of U.S. Army whistleblower Chelsea Manning say she has been held in solitary confinement since being sent back to prison on March 8th after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury. Manning had been subpoenaed by federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District for questioning over her 2010 release to WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. She was imprisoned from 2010 to 2017 for the leak. During this time, Manning was also held in solitary confinement, which she described as a, quote, practice that needs to be ended everywhere. Nothing justifies doing this to any human being, she said. The U.S. District Judge in Virginia overseeing the case said Manning would remain in jail until either she agrees to testify or the grand jury concludes its work. And a group of over 500 cities, counties, and Native American tribes filed a lawsuit against members of the Sackler family for their role in creating, quote, the worst drug crisis in American history, unquote, by lying about the dangers of the opioid painkiller OxyContin and deceitful marketing of the drug. The lawsuit filed last week in the Southern District of New York names 8 members of the Sackler family, which founded and owns Purdue Pharma, the maker of OxyContin, differentiating the case from other lawsuits which have targeted Purdue and other drug companies. Government data found deadly opioid overdoses are responsible for nearly 50,000 deaths per year in the United States. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. No collusion. That's the key finding of special counsel Robert Mueller's long-awaited report into whether President Trump and members of his campaign conspired with the Russian government to win the 2016 election. While the full report on Mueller's 22-month investigation has not yet been made public, Attorney General William Barr sent a 4-page letter to congressional leaders Sunday laying out his interpretation of Mueller's findings. Barr wrote the report concluded Russia meddled in the 2016 election, but that, quote, the special counsel's investigation did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with Russia in its efforts, unquote. Mueller also examined whether Trump could be criminally charged for obstructing justice, but he did not come to a definitive conclusion. Barr quoted a passage from the Mueller report saying, quote, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. In his letter, Barr, who became Attorney General just last month, announced he and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein had concluded there's not enough sufficient evidence to, quote, establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense, unquote. President Trump responded to Barr's letter by tweeting, no collusion, no obstruction, complete and total exoneration, keep America great. Trump later briefly spoke to the press.
So after a long look, after a long investigation, after so many people have been so badly hurt, after not looking at the other side, where a lot of bad things happened, a lot of horrible things happened, a lot of very bad things happened for our country. It was just announced there was no collusion with Russia, the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. There was no collusion with Russia. There was no obstruction, and none whatsoever. And it was a complete and total exoneration.
Democratic leaders on Capitol Hill are calling on Attorney General Robert Barr to release the full Mueller report as well as underlying documentation. Many Democrats criticize Barr for taking just 48 hours to conclude Trump had not committed obstruction of justice. This is New York Congressmember Jerrold Nadler, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee.
First, President Trump is wrong. This report does not amount to a so-called total exoneration. Special counsel Mueller was clear that his report, quote, does not exonerate, close quote, the president. The special counsel spent 22 months uncovering evidence of obstruction and other misconduct. Attorney General Barr, who auditioned for his role with an open memorandum suggesting that the obstruction investigation was unconscionable and that it was almost impossible for any president to commit obstruction of justice since he is the head of the executive branch, made a decision about that evidence in under 48 hours. His conclusions raise more questions than the answer, given the fact that Mueller uncovered evidence that, in his own words, does not exonerate the president. It is unconscionable that President Trump would try to spin the special counsel's findings as if his conduct was remotely acceptable.
In his report, special counsel Robert Mueller also recommended no further indictments in the Russia investigation. Over the past 22 months, Mueller secured 7 guilty pleas or convictions of Trump associates, including his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, former National Security Advisor, Mike Flynn, and Trump's former personal attorney, Michael Cohen. Mueller also indicted 13 Russians tied to the Internet Research Agency for meddling in the 2016 election, and 12 Russian military intelligence officers for allegedly hacking into the computer systems of the Democratic National Committee and the Clinton presidential campaign. While the Mueller probe is now over, Trump and his associates still face a number of investigations, including ones led by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, the Attorney General of New York, and congressional Democrats. To talk more about the Mueller report, we'll be joined by two guests after break. Two Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters, Glenn Greenwald, as well as David K. Johnston. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We'll be back with them in a minute.
Well, I've walked these streets, a virtual stage, it seemed to me. Makeup on their faces, actors took their places next to me. Well, I've walked these streets in a carnival of sights to see. All the cheap thrill seekers, vendors and the dealers, they crowded around me. Have I been blind? Have I been lost inside myself and my own mind? Hypnotized, mesmerized by what my eyes have seen.
Carnival by Natalie Merchant. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. To talk more about the Mueller report, we're joined by two guests. Glenn Greenwald, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, one of the founding editors of The Intercept, has been one of the most prominent skeptics of the Russiagate probe. He's speaking to us from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. David K. Johnston is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, previously with the New York Times, now founder and editor of DCReport.org. He's been reporting on Donald Trump since the 1980s, has written, well, most recently, 2 books on him. His most recent, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with David K. Johnston in Rochester, New York. David, your response to the Mueller report and to William Barr's summary of what he found.
Well, we don't know what's in the Mueller report. We only know the brief interpretation offered by Bill Barr. But that interpretation opens whole new cans of worms. The standard here should not be beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the criminal standard. The standard is the constitutional requirements, which are faithful execution of the office and high crimes and misdemeanors, which doesn't require any criminal offense of any kind, as the 18 impeachment proceedings we've had in this country have established beyond a doubt. We need to see the full report. We need to have Mueller's testimony. We need to know what it was that Mueller learned about such matters as Jared Kushner asking to use secret Russian diplomatic communications gear to contact the Kremlin without the knowledge of American intelligence, something the Russians made available to us to know by the way they transmitted a cable, knowing it would be read by intelligence agencies. We need to know why Don Jr., who said love it when offered help by the Kremlin, was not questioned or indicted, most likely because his lawyer said he would take the Fifth Amendment. But why was he not charged? And we need to know about why he didn't call FBI counterintelligence, which is the only thing any decent and patriotic American would do when given an offer by a foreign government to interfere in our election. And there's a lot more that we need to know. We need to see the report in full. We need to hear Mueller's testimony about it, not just Bill Barr's interpretation of it, especially given that Barr, sought this job and has positioned himself as someone who believes essentially the president virtually cannot commit a crime under our Constitution, certainly not obstruction of justice.
Glenn Greenwald, your response.
This is the saddest media spectacle I've ever seen since I began practicing journalism in 2005. And what makes it even sadder is to watch all of the people who vested their journalistic credibility into what proved to be a complete and total fraud and scam continue to try and cling to some vestige of credibility by continuing to spin conspiracy theories that are even more reckless and more unhinged than the ones to which we've been subjected for 3 years. The great journalist and writer Matt Taibbi wrote in an article over the weekend, and I agree with him completely, that as humiliating as the media debacle was leading up to the Iraq war, what they did over the last 3 years in the Trump-Russia story makes all of that look like a pimple. Even though obviously the Iraq war was much more destructive because it led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, the errors and lies and falsehoods and recklessness and speculation that we've been subjected to over and over and over that Robert Mueller just definitively debunked is far more humiliating journalistically, far more unjustifiably journalistically, and who knows where it will lead to. It's ratcheted up tensions between the two most dangerous nuclear-armed powers in the world, Russia and the United States, that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists says has brought us to 2 minutes before midnight on their doomsday clock. So it's also been extremely dangerous in ways that we don't yet know. Let me just say two things. Number one, everybody knows, and I don't care how many people try and rewrite history, that the central question that everybody was obsessed with for 3 years was, did Donald Trump, his family members, and his aides conspire and collaborate and collude with the Russians to interfere in the election? And contrary to what David just said, it is absolutely false that Robert Mueller simply said there's not enough evidence to convict with a reasonable doubt. He said something much, 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 much more important than that. He said that after 20 months of investigation, with a huge team of FBI agents and prosecutors heralded as being the most aggressive and skilled in the world, we found no evidence that this happened. That's what Robert Mueller said. The whole thing was a scam and a fraud from the beginning, and the New York Times headline today says that as clearly as it can. Robert Mueller finds no collusion between Trump and Russia. That was the focal point of the entire narrative, no matter how much people try and change the focus. The second point, this idea that, oh, we haven't heard from Robert Mueller yet. We've only heard Bill Barr's summary of him. Yes, that's true. But Bill Barr has been friends with Robert Mueller for 30 years. They come from the same Republican circles in the Department of Justice. They both worked together at the Bush Justice Department, the Bush 41 Justice Department. All we heard for 20 months is that Robert Mueller is a man of the greatest integrity and patriotism. The idea, the very idea, just think about this, that he would allow Bill Barr to run around making false and misleading distortions about what the Mueller team found, and not one person on the Mueller team, including Bob Mueller himself, would stand up and say, wait a minute, he's distorting what our findings was. That is laughable. That's exactly the kind of conspiracy theories that led to this entire mess in the first place, and we should no longer tolerate this. Rachel Maddow and MSNBC are the Judy Millers of this story, except unlike Judy Miller, who was scapegoated for doing things that her male colleague did and had her career destroyed, Rachel Maddow will continue to make $10 million a year for NBC because she's their most valuable brand, and there will be no reckoning and consequences for this story that the media got radically, fundamentally, and deliberately wrong for almost 3 years now in a very dangerous way.
David K. Johnston.
Well, you notice Glenn doesn't dispute what are established facts. We know that the Russians offered to help the Trump campaign. We have the emails proving that, and we know that Don Jr. was not interviewed. We know, as a matter of fact, unless the Russians fabricated the cable, in which case you would have expected denials from the Trump camp, that Jared Kushner sought to use the communications gear of the Russian diplomats, and that they put their cable on this out in a way knowing it would be intercepted. We know, and Glenn certainly wouldn't dispute, that the Russians tried to interfere in our election. Now, all of these facts are fundamental to what matters here. And the issue that matters is this began as a counterintelligence investigation, not a criminal investigation. And I don't think Bob Barr has completely, as Glenn suggested, distorted what was said here, but I think his 4-page summary doesn't give us the full picture. After all, the only place he quoted the Mueller report was that it did not exonerate Donald Trump on the issue of obstruction of justice. We need to see the report. And we can't draw the kind of conclusions that Glenn is drawing without actually seeing the document. There's a lot of gray area here, and the standard for the conduct of the president is not the standard of criminal liability. And just one other point. Let's remember that Donald Trump, who studied at the foot of Roy Cohn, as a young man beat 4 grand jury investigations. He escaped scrutiny for his role in the international drug trafficking of Joseph Wexelbaum, whom he wrote a letter saying he was a stand-up guy who shouldn't be punished, and engaged in behavior that made no sense unless the two of them were in the business together. That Trump has a long and thoroughly documented history of lying, of filing false reports, of cheating on his taxes, having been tried twice for income tax fraud and lost both of those cases. They were civil cases, but lost both. So I don't think you can draw the conclusions Glenn has drawn without seeing the Mueller report in full.
David K. Johnson, let me ask. I mean, you have been exposing Donald Trump for decades, not around the issue of collusion with Russia. Is it possible that what Donald Trump is guilty of is corruption, not collusion? I don't think Glenn Greenwald is saying that Donald Trump is innocent in all areas, but he's saying of this investigation, of these charges, he is.
Well, I personally have never once said or suggested that this is a criminal issue that should be treated as a criminal matter. I mean, I disagree with the Justice Department's 2 Office of Legal Counsel memoranda, as do a lot of people who study and write about and, like I do, teach our Constitution. But that's the broader issue here. What was the level of conduct? We know that Donald Trump invited the Russians to interfere in our election. So what did Mueller find? Let's understand what he found. That it didn't rise to the level of a crime, I just don't think is that significant. I want to know what they found. And one of the key questions I want to know is, did Don Jr., did Jared Kushner, and did Donald Trump's lawyers say that if questioned, they would take the Fifth Amendment? Now, we all have a Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate ourselves, but it would be untenable for a sitting president of the United States to take the Fifth Amendment. He would be a unique case in that matter, he and the vice president, if the Fifth Amendment was put forward.
Glenn Greenwald.
So let me just say a couple of things. First of all, prior to Bob Mueller's appointment, I was calling for a full-scale investigation in which all of the facts at the conclusion of the investigation would be publicly revealed so that we would stop having to rely on media leaks that the CIA and the NSA and the FBI were engineering and manipulating and lying to us, as we now know, so that we could see the full picture. So I continue to believe that we should see the full Mueller report. I support that completely. Secondly, let me say as well that I believe that Donald Trump is one of the most corrupt people ever to occupy the White House. I'm certain that he's guilty of all kinds of crimes, war crimes as president, financial crimes as a business person. One of the reasons why those of us who are so angry about this obsession on Russia and collusion, aside from the fact that it was so dangerous to ratchet up tensions between 2 nuclear armed powers this way instead of trying to forge a peace between these 2 countries, is precisely because it took the oxygen away from all of the things that the Trump administration is doing that is so damaging in lieu of this idiotic, moronic, Tom Clancy-type espionage thriller where we were talking about Putin blackmailing Donald Trump with PP tapes and Donald Trump being a Russian agent since 1987, which was a cover story that was on New York Magazine that Chris Hayes put on MSNBC. Just all kinds of moronic conspiracies that we love to mock other countries' medias for circulating and disseminating, drowned out our airways and our discourse for 3 years, preventing us from focusing on the real substantive damage that the Trump administration is doing and that Donald Trump's corruption entails. But the reality is the media chose to focus on this. Everybody knows this. David K. Johnson was on your show, Amy, a week ago, and he said, Donald Trump, I believe, is a Russian agent. We now have a full-scale 20-month investigation by somebody that everybody agreed was a man of great integrity who would get to the bottom of all of this, who had full subpoena power. And David keeps trying to imply, which is totally false, that all that Mueller said was, oh, it just doesn't rise to the level of criminality. That is not what he said. He said, after 20 months of a full-scale investigation, which, by the way, included hours of interrogating Donald Trump Jr. before Congress, all of the transcripts of which were made available to Mueller, which he could have prosecuted Trump Jr. on for perjury and obstruction had Donald Trump Jr. lied about anything, but he chose not to. He said, after reviewing all of this evidence, I am concluding that this did not happen. Not that it doesn't rise to the level where I can criminally prosecute. He's saying there was no collusion. The game is over, and it's time to be honest about it. And the more we try to cling to this and invent new you know what it reminds me of? In 2003, when the neocons finally had to face the truth, that there were no WMDs, that they had fabricated that the media had misled millions of people around the world for years, and they started saying, maybe Saddam hid them in Syria. Maybe they're buried in places we just haven't looked yet. It's time to face the truth. The media got this story wrong. They obsessed on this for 3 years, and all this time there was no evidence for it. It was just a conspiracy theory. Rachel Maddow, the most influential liberal TV host in the country, every single night misled millions of liberals into believing something that was totally false, and there will be no media consequences for it. And that is extremely grave and serious, no matter how much is true about how corrupt Donald Trump is in his financial dealings or any of the other stuff that people are now trying to deflect our attention onto.
Glenn Greenwald, I want to ask you to imagine for a moment if this investigation didn't happen for the last 3 years, or whether it did, but the press didn't pay it much attention until Mueller came up with his results as he has now. What the press could have been doing, you alluded to it in the last answer, dealing with issues. For example, we're moving into the 2020 presidential election now. Coming out of the defeat of Hillary Clinton, what could the media have done if it wasn't saying it was simply stolen from her, but exactly what the policies the Democrats were representing that might have led to her defeat?
Right. That's the question. Why did millions of people vote for a complete joke of a game show host? And how did the Democrats lose the presidency to one of the most embarrassing spectacles of a candidate in U.S. history? What is the prevailing ideology of the ruling class that has turned millions and millions of people into this country into such angry citizens that they either refuse to vote or vote for the person who promises to burn down the entire system? Why are they so angry? What has happened to their economic security? What ideology and what group of people are responsible for that? What has Donald Trump been doing in realigning the United States away from the Western Europe and to Saudi despots? And the collusion that actually happened, which was from the Israeli government during the election in order to undermine Obama's policies. All those kinds of questions could have been asked and should have been asked, but it all got drowned out because we were all so much more fascinated by this superficial, kind of very appealing and melodramatic espionage thriller that has completely destroyed the credibility of the U.S. media and so tragically vindicated Donald Trump in a way that probably is the greatest gift that has been given to him throughout his entire presidency.
David K. Johnston, you've continually raised over the last years of the Trump administration and the decades before the corruption of Donald Trump. Aren't you concerned now that he has been, in his own words, exonerated, although Mueller didn't exactly say that when it came to obstruction of justice, but when it came to collusion, he absolutely exonerated him. Yes, we haven't seen the underlying report. That the issues you have raised for decades, you won't be able to be taken seriously about them because Donald Trump will move forward with new moral force because he says he has been victimized for the last few years since he became president by this investigation by a man he claimed to have hated who ultimately vindicated him.
Well, indeed, Amy, and I suspect Glenn has not read my books. My trilogy on the American economy that you had me on when it came out, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and the Fine Print, explains why a man like Donald Trump could rise because of government policies nobody knew about until I spent years digging them out of the public record, showed how we are picking the pockets of ordinary Americans and transferring money upward to other people. And even people who don't understand that know that their economics today are worse than they were in the 1960s. So I was in the vanguard of explaining those things. My 2 books on Donald Trump say almost nothing about Russia. And in particular, the most recent book is about what Donald Trump is doing to our government. And what is DC Report, the little news organization that friends and I run as a mostly volunteer project? It is about what he's doing to our government. We've done very little reporting about the Russians other than things like Wilbur Ross's deep involvement with the corrupt Bank of Cyprus, which is well known for Russian money laundering. Other than that, it's been about what's the Interior Department doing? What are other government agencies doing? So Glenn's complaints, well, are arguably have a good merit. They don't apply to me by any stretch, and I've never said that Donald Trump is an agent. I've said he's an asset. If I did say agent, I should not have, but I've said repeatedly he is what the old Soviet would call a useful idiot. He has advanced their cause. He called during the campaign for breaking up NATO. That's a Putin item. He has said he trusts Vladimir Putin and not the American intelligence agencies. Those should all be things that deeply disturb us. And if the Mueller report, when we see it, shows that this is all malarkey, have me on and I'll say, you know what, got it totally wrong, because I go wherever the facts go. But I don't think the news media in this country has been totally discredited. And I noticed that Glenn's focus is on one cable TV show. By the way, I think I've been on once since Donald Trump's election on Rachel Maddow when I got the tax return of Donald Trump from 2005. I don't appear on her show otherwise. And so I think fundamentally we do need to focus on the real economic issues. Donald Trump wants to make health care in America worse. He has not fulfilled any of his promises. There's no infrastructure bill. There is this focus on the wall with Mexico, which is never going to be built and certainly not paid for by the Mexicans. He has stirred violence against people of color and people whose religions he doesn't like. And he is utterly and completely unfit to hold office. He is, in the classic meaning of the Greek word, an idiot, which originally meant someone who only cares about himself and has no regard for the society around him.
David, on the show last week, you did say Russian agent, that Donald Trump is a Russian agent. Are you saying you misspoke?
I should have said asset. That's a misstatement by me. And asset is the term that I've used. And I do believe that, you can unwittingly be an asset. And I believe that Donald Trump is a Russian asset. I think the kindest thing you can say about Donald Trump is that he has divided loyalties between the United States of America and the Kremlin based on his own public statements, his secret meetings with Vladimir Putin, his destruction of notes and not taking other people with him to those meetings. That the kindest thing you can say is he has divided loyalties, and that alone makes him unfit under our Constitution because it means he cannot and is not faithfully executing his office.
To be exact, you said Kremlin agent, but you're saying you should have said Kremlin asset?
Yes.
So data from the TV News Archive show, on average, every day in 2018, CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC devoted 3% of their news coverage, not counting commercials and non-news programming, to the Robert Mueller investigation. Upon hindsight, David K. Johnston, do you think that the corporate media was wrong and should have focused on some of the issues that Glenn Greenwald has just laid out?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I think we should have focused much more on the Donald Trump's not fulfilling his promises. I will tell you there's clearly a limited audience for that. I mean, we are covering governance at DC Report. We have broken on a budget of $5,000 or $6,000 a month about 20 stories that other people have picked up on about what's being done to our government. But our audience, compared to all the other places, we're little tiny pipsqueaks down here. It's unfortunate, but most Americans not only don't know what's in their Constitution, but they also really don't care about governance. They do care about pocketbook issues and the influence Trump is having on health care, the expansion of pollution, the coziness with oil companies and uranium mining companies, the damage to our forests and national parks, that should all be big news. You know, there was almost no reporting about what I thought was one of the most delicious scandals of this year, when all the national parks and monuments were shut down during the government shutdown. One place remained open with a ranger. That's the clock tower atop the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was exempted. Nothing better illustrates Donald Trump's complete corruption and abuse of power.
Do you think that that both Congress and also the other investigatory bodies like the New York Attorney General, Southern District in New York, et cetera, are going to continue investigating him now that, you know, he's saying he has been victimized since he became president on charges that were found to be completely unfounded?
Well, I think that the Congress is going to continue to press for answers and to see the full Mueller report. There are all sorts of other issues beyond this that need to be thoroughly investigated, and we've been in the forefront, and I have in my writings and TV appearances of pressing that we need to be understanding what Trump is doing to corrupt our government and damage our Constitution. So, yes, I expect those to go forward. And we need to also remember that Donald Trump's a man whose experience right within the period since the campaign shows that crime pays. He ripped off people with Trump University for $40 million. He didn't pay any penalty. He only had to return $25 million of the $40 million. You know, Donald Trump's life experience is crime pays. He's he owned the only casino in which there is a known case of cheating customers in Atlantic City, was at Trump's Castle. And so, you know, we need to recognize we have a man in the White House who is a third-generation head of a white-collar crime family. But I also think firmly that we need to understand his relationship and his attitudes and his treatment regarding the Kremlin, which is a hostile foreign power that was attacking our elections. Mueller's report, as explained by Bill Barr, says they were attacking our election. And Donald Trump encouraged that attack. That should disturb us deeply.
Glenn Greenwald, before we go to break and then come back, respond to what David K. Johnston said. And also this alert from FAIR, from July of last year. They put out an alert stating, action alert. It's been over a year since MSNBC has mentioned U.S. war in Yemen.
Yeah, that's the tragedy of everything that just happened. I mean, David and I have known each other for many years. We have respect for each other's work. I mean, I'll be presumptive enough to say that I certainly have respect for his. And part of the reason why I find this whole thing so tragic is because all the things that he just named that do deserve attention and investigation have received none, because completely drowning out all of that has been this utter fairy tale. But let me just say one thing about this idea that he's a Kremlin asset, or that we need to find out what his relationship is with the Russians. We just had a 22-month investigation where the media and Bob Mueller did nothing but look into that exact question. He's saying it like nobody's ever asked this before, we have the answer. And as for him being a Russian asset, it's so irresponsible to say that, because the reality is that the conflict between the U.S. and the Russians are at a worse and higher level than they've been in many years, probably decades. How can you say Donald Trump is a stooge of the Kremlin when he's right now trying to remove one of Vladimir Putin's client regime states in Venezuela, or when he's trying to bully Angela Merkel out of buying Russian natural gas, probably the thing that's most important to the Russian economy, or when he sold lethal arms to the Ukrainians, something Obama refused to do on the grounds that it would be provocative to Russia, or when he bombed Putin's client state in Syria. Over and over, the Trump administration has taken actions far more adverse and aggressive and belligerent to the Russians than the Obama administration did. That's why this whole narrative that Trump all along was being blackmailed by Putin, that he's an asset of Russian intelligence. This is idiocy. It is completely irrational. It is contrary to all facts. And Bob Mueller's investigation, who spent 22 months examining that core question, what is the relationship between Trump and the Russians, concluded
that there is no relationship. It's time to stop these dangerous conspiracy theories that are ratcheting up tensions between the two most dangerous countries on the planet. The reality is the Trump administration has been constantly belligerent to Putin, has constantly acted adverse to the Kremlin's interests, and there's zero basis for thinking or believing or finding evidence to assert that Trump in any way is beholden to Vladimir Putin and to Russia. The whole thing has been a joke and a fairy tale from the start.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. Glenn Greenwald, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, founding editor of The Intercept. David K. Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, formerly with The New York Times, now founder and editor of DCReport.org. Stay with us.
I put a spell on you. Because you're mine. Stop the things you do. What's up? I ain't lying. Yeah, I can't stand. Woo! No running around. I can't stand. No put me down. I put a spell on you.
I Put a Spell on You by Screamin' Jay Hawkins. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're joined by two Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, Glenn Greenwald and David K. Johnston, as we look at the results of the 22-month investigation by Special Counsel Mueller. I want to continue, as we discuss the Mueller report, to turn to Noam Chomsky when he appeared on Democracy Now! Last August.
So take, say, the huge issue of interference in our pristine elections. Did the Russians interfere in our elections? An issue of overwhelming concern in the media. I mean, in most of the world, that's almost a joke. First of all, if you're interested in foreign interference in our elections, whatever the Russians may have done, barely counts weighs in the balance as compared with what another state does openly, brazenly, and with enormous support. Israeli intervention in U.S. elections vastly overwhelms anything the Russians may have done. I mean, even to the point where the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, goes directly to Congress without even informing the president and speaks to Congress with overwhelming applause to try to undermine the president's policies. What happened with Obama and Netanyahu in 2015.
So that's MIT Professor Emeritus Noam Chomsky, world-renowned linguist, a well-known dissident, is writer of over 100 books. Glenn Greenwald, can you respond?
Well, that's been the other critical point this entire time, this kind of melodrama over the outrage that any country would dare to interfere in our sacred and glorious democracy when, as Noam Chomsky just pointed out and has spent the last 40 years pointing out, the United States has done very little since the end of World War II but going around the world and interfering in every single democracy that they can find, literally, including the country in which I'm currently living, which is Brazil, where they overthrew a democratically elected government in 1964 and then proceeded to impose a military regime for 21 years, and also Russia, where they openly boasted about helping to elect Boris Yeltsin because he would privatize everything and that would be good for U.S. industry, or even agitating anti-Putin resistance in parliamentary elections under Hillary Clinton's reign as Secretary of State. This doesn't make it right for Russia to do it, but we've never kept in perspective
the fact that interfering or meddling in other countries' elections or governance is not some grave, aberrational, never-before-heard drama that the entire world has to stop and lament and put an end to. It's normal business. We're currently right now in the process of trying to change the government of Venezuela openly, and have done so over and over around the world. And that's why Noam Chomsky says that all of this moral outrage of Americans at the idea that somebody would interfere in or meddle in our democracy has made the U.S. a laughingstock to the hundreds of millions of people, billions in fact, who live in countries where the U.S. has done this and far, far worse for decade after decade after decade.
And David K. Johnston, your response?
Well, we live in a world in which governments interfere in the elections of other governments, and the U.S. has had dirty hands about this. Heck, I think I wrote a few stories that touched on this in the 60s when I was covering local government in the San Francisco Bay Area, but also student demonstrations. There's no question that we have overthrown regimes and put in place terrible dictators, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be outraged, and we should be, at Russian interference in our election. Now, if Glenn had looked at my Twitter feed, he would know that a lot of people attacked him as being illegitimate, and I defended him. We disagree, but I think we have honest disagreements about what matters here. Glenn sees the Russia matters as very black and white. He says there's no evidence, for example. In fact, I see them as what I believe they are, very gray. We have lots of evidence of extraordinary conduct. Russia, if you're listening, love it when the Kremlin offers help. The request to use communications gear, the discrediting of American intelligence agencies while accepting Vladimir Putin at his word and meeting him with no other staff around and destroying the translator's notes, or meeting with no American translator, and the disclosure in the Oval Office of sources and methods to the Russian foreign minister and the Russian ambassador, which we learned about only because of the Russians, not the White House. All of that is extraordinary behavior that is unlike any former president. And so we should be very concerned about that, and we do not know enough to understand how this could happen. Just imagine for a moment if Barack Obama had done some of the things that Donald Trump has done, what the reaction in Congress would be. And I also think the proper measure here is not Barack Obama's foreign policy, but what Hillary Clinton made clear she would have done if she had become president. I don't think she would have been a particularly great president, but she made it very clear that short of going to war, she was going to squeeze the Kremlin until they gave up Crimea. Putin understood this perfectly, and so while he didn't so much want Donald Trump, he certainly did not want Hillary Clinton, who would have made things economically very painful for him, and she was quite explicit about this.
Glenn Greenwald, if you can quickly respond to that, but I want to end on the issue of where does this leave WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and also Chelsea Manning, who's been held in solitary confinement since being sent back to prison on March 8th after refusing to answer questions before a grand jury. She'd been subpoenaed by the federal prosecutors in Virginia's Eastern District for questioning over her 2010 release of WikiLeaks of hundreds of thousands of State Department and Pentagon documents about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
David is right that there was a big difference between Obama and Clinton when it came to foreign policy. She was very critical of Obama for not being more confrontational with Putin, for refusing to bomb Syria, for refusing to send lethal arms to Ukrainians, for working with Russia on the Iran deal. I side with President Obama. He was absolutely right that Hillary Clinton would have been extremely dangerous because she wanted to be way more provocative and belligerent toward Russia, and I'm very glad she didn't get that chance to do that. That would have been very dangerous for the world, although the Trump administration is doing it now. As for Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks, the Trump administration has made no secret of the fact that they want to prosecute WikiLeaks for the crime in their eyes of disclosing confidential documents, one of the gravest threats we can imagine to press freedom. Chelsea Manning's torture, being put back into solitary confinement, is trying to squeeze her to say things that aren't true to let them prosecute WikiLeaks. And all of the journalists who have spent 3 years claiming to be so worried about the threats to press freedom are utterly silent about what the Trump administration's real threat to press freedom is, which is this attempt to prosecute WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, abusing Chelsea Manning to do it in order to criminalize journalism, which is the publication of top secret documents that journalists do every day. And I hope that gets way more attention.
We're going to have to leave it there. I thank you both so much. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists Glenn Greenwald and David K. Johnston. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.